Nia Carter knelt on the plush, midnight blue rug of Lee Yi-hyun's private study, scrubbing and rescrubbing a stubborn coffee stain near the edge of his mahogany desk. The fourth time she worked the bristles, she prayed the blemish would finally lift, but the fibers remained defiant. In this house, perfection was a requirement for survival, and Nia had spent 2 years perfecting the art of being invisible. A miracle had never come for her, and she didn't expect one to materialize amidst the cold steel and high-frequency trading screens of the Lee Syndicate. The digital clock on the wall glowed with a predatory red, counting down the 60 minutes left until the markets opened in Seoul. Behind her, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the sour tang of panic. Cho Dong-wook and his team of elite advisors stood huddled around the primary monitor, their hands trembling as they refreshed the failing ledger. $8 billion was hemorrhaging into a digital black hole, and they had exactly 1 hour to find the leak. Outside, a summer storm battered the Seoul skyline, thunder booming so hard it vibrated the floorboards beneath Nia's knees. Rain lashed the reinforced glass like angry fists. Nia stared into the bucket of gray water, her own hunger gnawing at her ribs. A familiar companion she'd learned to ignore over the past 3 years of tuition payments and late shifts. The lights in the study flickered. She held her breath, praying the servers wouldn't cut out. Their security was failing. Their logic was failing. Everything in this room was failing. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a quiet, urgent notification from her university's financial aid office. Final notice. Unpaid tuition balance of $4,500 due by midnight. Failure to pay will result in immediate withdrawal and loss of student visa status. Nia looked up from the rug, her eyes involuntarily darting to the wall monitor. The experts were screaming about a hack, but she saw it, the misplaced variable in the third line of the source code. A simple human error worth billions. She looked at the frantic, powerful men in the room, then at her raw, wet hands. The choice was a razor's edge: remain a ghost or step into the light of a world that ate people like her alive. The heavy oak doors of the study closed behind the retreating advisors, leaving a silence more deafening than their previous shouting. Nia didn't linger to watch them go. She returned to her bucket, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had broken the first rule of the house: stay invisible. By the time she reached her cramped room in the servants' wing, her hands were shaking so violently she could barely turn the brass knob. She sat on the edge of her narrow cot, staring at the final notice on her phone. The blue light washed over her face, highlighting the exhaustion she usually kept tucked behind a mask of professional indifference. She was so close to finishing her degree, so close to proving that the fire that took her family hadn't consumed her future, too. But MIT was thousands of miles away, and the scholarship she'd lost was a ghost she couldn't outrun. A sharp, rhythmic rapping at her door made her jump. It wasn't the soft tap of a fellow maid. It was the heavy, authoritative knock of Kang D-sik, the boss's personal bodyguard. "The master wants you," D-sik said through the wood, his voice a low, emotionless rumble. "Now." Nia smoothed her apron, took a steadying breath, and followed him back to the grand study. The atmosphere had shifted. The storm outside had settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse of rain, but the electricity inside the room was concentrated entirely on Lee Yi-hyun. He wasn't looking at the monitors anymore. He was sitting behind his desk, holding a thin manila folder, her personnel file. "Nia Carter," he said, his voice dropping the sharp edges he used for his underlings. He didn't look up as she entered. "You've been here 2 years, you're quiet, you're efficient, you never look me in the eye." He finally looked up, his piercing dark eyes pinning her to the spot. "But you didn't just notice a variable, did you? You understood the entire architecture of the algorithm." He tapped the folder. "I had D-sik run a deeper trace. MIT, junior year, top of your class in applied mathematics and systems engineering. Then a fire in Chicago, no survivors, no more tuition." Nia felt the air leave the room. The secret she had guarded like a weapon was laid bare on the mahogany desk. "I do my job, Mr. Lee," she whispered, her voice tight. "The floors are clean. The coffee is hot." "The floors are a waste of your time," Yi Hyan countered, standing up. He moved toward her, his tailored suit shifting with a predatory grace. He stopped just outside her personal space, the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold rain surrounding her. "I don't need someone to scrub rugs, Nia. I have 100 people for that. I need someone who can see the cracks in my empire before the water starts pouring in." He leaned closer, his dark eyes searching hers for the spark he had seen at the whiteboard. "You aren't a maid. You're a survivor who happens to be a genius, and starting tomorrow, you're going to help me run this city." The conference room felt like a pressurized chamber, the air thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the sharp, metallic tang of cold sweat. Lee Yi-hyan stood at the head of the table, his silhouette framed by the sprawling skyline of Seoul, while Nia stood beside him. She had traded her apron for a simple, sharp blazer, but she could still feel the phantom weight of the scrub brush in her hand. Cho Dong-wook, the lead advisor who had spent the last decade guarding the syndicate's treasury, slammed his fist onto the mahogany surface. "This is an insult, master. You're casting aside years of loyalty for a girl who was emptying our trash bins yesterday. She's a maid. She's a fluke." Yi Hyan didn't blink. He reached out, picked up Dong-wook's gold-plated nameplate and slid it across the table until it fell off the edge, clattering onto the floor. "She's the reason your bank accounts still have numbers in them this morning, Cho. You had 12 hours, she had 60 seconds. He turned his gaze to the rest of the men in the room, a sea of tailored suits and hardened expressions. "Nia Carter is now my chief strategist. Her voice is my voice. If that is an insult to your pride, you are welcome to leave, but you will leave everything you own behind." The silence that followed was brutal. Nia felt the heat of a dozen glares, each one a silent blade. These men didn't just see a maid. They saw a woman, a foreigner, and an interloper who had bypassed the hierarchy they had bled to climb. "The architecture of the new merger is flawed," Nia said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. She stepped toward the primary monitor, her athletic frame poised and alert. "You're accounting for the market volatility, but you're ignoring the latency in the blockchain settlement. If we move the assets at noon, we lose 3% to the slippage." "Listen to her," one of the younger advisors sneered, leaning back with a dismissive smirk. "She thinks a university dropout can teach us how to move weight." Nia turned, her eyes flashing with a wit that had been suppressed for too long. "I don't think I can teach you, Mr. Park. I know I can. Because while you were busy padding your expense reports, I was reading the data logs you left on the printer every night." She tapped a command into the keyboard, and a hidden subledger appeared on the screen, highlighted in a damning red. "This isn't a hack. It's an internal leak, and I've already traced the IP address to your private office." The blood drained from Park's face. The room shifted instantly from mockery to a cold, predatory stillness. Yi Hyan didn't have to say a word. He simply looked at Nia with a dark, admiring approval. She wasn't just sitting in the chair. She was dismantling the old guard piece by piece. The transition wasn't going to be a handshake. It was going to be a war. The chandelier-lit ballroom of the Lot Hotel shimmered with the dangerous elegance of Seoul's elite. Nia felt the heavy weight of 100 gazes, each one sharp enough to draw blood. She wore a floor-length gown of midnight silk, a gift from Yi Hyan that felt more like armor than evening wear. Though she had traded her maid's uniform for couture, she could still feel the phantom sting of cleaning chemicals on her skin. Seo Minjai moved through the crowd like a shark in white lace. She approached Nia, a flute of champagne held with practiced grace, her eyes tracing Nia's silhouette with visible disdain. "It's fascinating, isn't it?" Minjai's voice carried just far enough to quiet the surrounding conversations. "The way a bit of silk can hide the scent of floor wax. Tell me, Nia, is the wine tonight better than the dishwater you're used to?" A ripple of cruel, stifled laughter moved through the circle of socialites. Nia felt the heat rise in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She remembered the complex derivatives she had calculated that morning and the way Yi Hyun's empire leaned on her logic. She took a slow sip of her drink, her gaze steady. "The wine is exceptional, Minjai," Nia replied, her voice smooth and carrying a clinical edge. "But I suppose I've spent so much time cleaning up messes that I've developed a keen eye for them. For instance, I noticed your family's logistics firm just reported a 12% discrepancy in their quarterly shipping audits. It's a shame. The math is quite messy. Perhaps that's why you're so focused on the floor." The laughter died instantly. The guests shifted, their eyes widening as they realized Nia wasn't just a guest. She was the ledger holder. Minjai's face drained of color, her polished composure cracking under the weight of a public financial exposure. "You wouldn't dare," Minjai hissed, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and fear. "I don't have to dare," Nia said, leaning in close enough to smell the bitter almond of Minjai's perfume. "I already fixed the error for the syndicate. Consider it a professional courtesy from the help." A heavy hand settled on the small of Nia's back. Lee Yi-hyun stood behind her, his presence an absolute shadow that demanded silence. He didn't look at his girlfriend. His dark, piercing eyes were fixed on Nia with a look of terrifying pride. "Is there a problem?" Yi-hyun asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. "No problem, Yi-hyun," Nia said, offering a small, witty smile. "We were just discussing the importance of a clean record." Yi-hyun took the champagne glass from Nia's hand and set it on a passing tray, never breaking eye contact. "Save your breath for the board meeting. I've seen enough of the socialites tonight." He turned Nia away from the stunned crowd, leading her toward the exit. In that moment, the hierarchy of the house had been rewritten in front of the entire city. Minjai was a ghost. Nia was the queen. The morning sun struggled to pierce the thick, velvet curtains of the nursery wing, a part of the estate that felt strangely isolated from the high-stakes digital warfare occurring in the study. Nia had been summoned not by the boss, but by a quiet intuition that something was amiss in the silence of the second floor. She found 6-year-old Hana sitting on a low stool, staring at a plate of untouched, cold breakfast. Seo Minjai stood by the window, her back turned to the child, voice sharp as she hissed into a private cell phone about boutique openings and social standings. "She won't eat and she won't speak," Minjai snapped, turning around as Nia entered. She didn't look at Hana with affection but with the irritation one might reserve for a malfunctioning appliance. "The child is dull, just like her mother was. Keep her occupied, Nia. I have a luncheon." With a dismissive wave of a manicured hand, Minjai swept out, the scent of her cloying perfume lingering like a toxic cloud. Nia knelt beside the girl, noticing the way Hana's small shoulders were hunched, a defensive posture Nia knew all too well. On the table lay a series of logic puzzles and basic math workbooks, discarded and marked with frustrated red scribbles. "They're too slow for you, aren't they?" Nia asked softly. Hana looked up, her big, expressive eyes searching Nia's face for the usual condescension. Finding none, she pushed a workbook toward Nia. It was a pattern recognition test meant for children twice her age. Hana hadn't failed it. She had redesigned it, connecting the dots in a non-linear way that mirrored the complex architecture of a neural network. Nia felt a jolt of recognition. The girl wasn't dull. She was a prodigy drowning in a world that only valued her as a decorative accessory. Nia pulled a tablet from her bag and opened a sandbox coding environment she'd been working on. "Minjai thinks you're quiet because you have nothing to say," Nia whispered, sliding the screen toward the child. "I think you're quiet because the world is too loud. Let's build something that talks back." Within an hour, Hana's small fingers were flying across the interface. She wasn't just learning, she was absorbing. Nia watched as the girl solved a recursive loop that would have stumped most college freshmen. Under Nia's tutelage, the nursery transformed from a cold playroom into a sanctuary of high-level thought. As they worked, the door creaked open. Lee Yi-hyun stood in the threshold, his dark eyes taking in the scene. The maid-turned-strategist and his silent daughter huddled over a screen, their minds locked in a language he realized he didn't fully understand. He saw the light in Hana's eyes, a spark of brilliance he hadn't known existed. In that moment, the bond between Nia and the House of Lee shifted from professional necessity to something far more dangerous, a shared soul. The digital silence of the estate was shattered at 3 a.m. by a single, rhythmic pulse on Nia's encrypted tablet. It was a ghost in the machine, a microleak of exactly 0.001% of the syndicate's liquid crypto assets. To anyone else, it would look like a rounding error or a network glitch. But to Nia, it was a deliberate, surgical bleed designed to test the new firewall she had built. She sat at the terminal in the dimly lit command center, her eyes reflecting the scrolling lines of green code. The leak wasn't coming from an external hack. The handshake protocol originated from an authorized terminal within the estate's own intranet. She traced the packet hop, her heart quickening as the path led directly toward the executive wing. It was a breadcrumb trail left by someone who knew the system's blind spots. A shadow detached itself from the doorway, tall and immovable. Kang D-Sik, the personal bodyguard whose loyalty was as legendary as his silence, stepped into the light. He didn't look at the screens. His gaze was fixed on the hallway behind him. "You found it," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried over the hum of the servers. "It's an internal bypass," Nia whispered, her fingers hovering over the keys. "Someone used an administrative override. If I follow this bridge, I can identify the biometric signature used to authorize the transfer." D-Sik moved with a sudden, fluid speed, his hand coming down firmly on Nia's wrist, stopping her mid-keystroke. The strength in his grip was a silent testament to his lethality. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, his expression as cold as a winter morning in the DMZ. "Don't," he warned. "In this house, the truth doesn't set you free, Nia. It buries you. You've moved too fast and the old guard is starving. If you name a name that the master isn't ready to hear, you won't live to see the dawn." "I was hired to protect his assets, D-Sik," Nia countered, her eyes flashing with a spark of her old defiance. "That includes protecting him from the people in his own shadow." "He knows," D-Sik replied, slowly releasing her wrist. "But he is playing a game of chess and you are currently his most valuable piece. If you reveal your hand now, you force him to sacrifice you to maintain the balance of the syndicate. Lock the leak, mask the trace, and wait. Let them think they are winning." Nia looked back at the screen, at the damning evidence of a betrayal that reached into the very heart of Yi Hyan's inner circle. She realized then that the numbers were the easy part. Navigating the blood-soaked politics of the Lee family was a logic puzzle where a single wrong move meant a permanent deletion. She deleted the trace logs and closed the connection, the weight of the secret settling into her chest like lead. The war had moved from the whiteboard to the hallways, and the enemy was closer than she ever imagined. The following morning, the atmosphere in the estate was as cold as a morgue. Nia was intercepted in the corridor by a phalanx of security guards, their faces set in grim masks. Leading them was Seo Minjai, her eyes gleaming with a triumphant, sharp light. She looked like a woman who had finally cornered her prey. "Search her room," Minjai commanded, her voice ringing out with feigned heartbreak. "I saw her slipping into the master's private study late last night. I didn't want to believe it, Yi Hyan, but the security of the family must come first." Lee Yi Hyan stood at the end of the hallway, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. He watched in silence as the guards ransacked Nia's small living quarters. Within seconds, a guard pulled a thick, leather-bound folder from beneath Nia's mattress. He opened it to reveal the highly classified blueprints for the upcoming merger, along with a list of encrypted offshore bank account numbers. "Explain this, Nia," Yi Hyan said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. Minjai stepped forward, her voice a poisonous honey. "She's been selling you out, darling, a girl with her background. She probably thought she could take the money and disappear back to the States before you noticed. Nia didn't look at the documents. She didn't even look at the guards. Her gaze remained fixed on the digital smart lock on her door, her mind already running through the binary history of the house. I was in the command center until 4:00 a.m., Mr. Lee, Nia said, her voice steady and clinical. You can verify that with the biometric logs, but more importantly, you should check the audit trail of that folder. The folder is physical evidence, you fool, Minjai spat. Everything in this house is smart tagged, Nia countered, gesturing toward the small, nearly invisible RFID chip embedded in the folder's corner. Every document in your study is tracked by the localized GPS mesh. If you pull the heat map for this folder's movements over the last 6 hours, you'll see it didn't move from the study to my room by my hand. Yi Hyun pulled out his phone, his thumb swiping across the screen with predatory speed. The silence in the hallway became suffocating. On the screen, a glowing red line traced the folder's journey. It had indeed left the study at 2:15 a.m., while Nia was logged into the server, and it had been carried by a device registered to Seo Minjai's private biometric profile. The color drained from Minjai's face so quickly she looked like a ghost. She opened her mouth to speak, but Yi Hyun held up a single, silencing finger. You played a game of logic against a mathematician, Minjai, Yi Hyun said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. A grave mistake. He didn't look at his girlfriend as he gestured for the guards to remove her. He looked at Nia. He saw the way she stood, unflinching, her mind always 3 steps ahead of the trap. He realized then that she wasn't just his strategist. She was the only person in the estate he could truly trust to see through the shadows. The frame had broken, and in its shards, Nia's power had only grown sharper. The aftermath of Minjai's betrayal left a vacuum in the estate that was colder than the storm. Late that night, Nia found Yi Hyun not in his command center, but in the dimly lit gallery overlooking the gardens. He had discarded his suit jacket, his silk shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the edge of a dark tattoo that crept up his collarbone, a jagged reminder of the violence that had built his throne. He was staring at a framed photograph on the wall, a candid shot of Hana laughing as she chased a butterfly. The ruthless patriarch was gone, replaced by a man whose shoulders seemed bowed by the weight of 1,000 sins. The merger isn't just about money, Nia, he said, his voice barely a whisper against the glass. The advisors think I'm expanding. They think I'm building a bigger cage, but I'm trying to find the door. Nia stepped into the light, her presence silent and grounding. You're trying to go legitimate. You want to move the assets into clean tech and logistics before the syndicate's past catches up to Hana. Yi Hyun turned, his dark eyes searching hers with a raw, desperate honesty. I've spent 15 years building a world where fear is the only currency. Now, I want to give my daughter a world where she doesn't have to check the shadows before she enters a room. But the transition is a minefield. One slip in the audit, one trace of black money in the new holdings, and the government will dismantle everything. Hana will be left with nothing but my enemies. Nia looked at the digital schematics of the merger still glowing on her tablet. She realized then that she wasn't just his strategist, she was his bridge. The financial expert, advisors knew how to hide money, but they didn't know how to wash a legacy clean. They lacked the clinical, surgical precision of someone who had lived on both sides of the glass. You can't do it with fear anymore, Yi Hyun, Nia said, stepping closer until she could see the reflection of the city lights in his eyes. Legitimacy requires a different kind of strength. It requires transparency where you've always used shadows. I can build the firewall that keeps the old world out, but you have to trust me to handle the keys. Yi Hyun reached out, his fingers hovering near her cheek before he pulled back, as if afraid his touch might stain her. I've never trusted anyone with the keys to my life, Nia, but looking at you, I realize you're the only person who sees the man I want to be, rather than the monster I've had to become. In the quiet of the gallery, the power dynamic shifted again. Nia saw the path forward clearly. She wasn't just saving his fortune, she was architecting his redemption. She was the key to his legitimacy, the one mind capable of weaving a clean future out of a blood-soaked past. The king was vulnerable, and for the first time, he wasn't alone in the dark. The tension within the Lee estate had reached a crystalline fragility as the final hours before the merger countdown began. The Grand Office was a hive of controlled chaos, with the remaining advisors hunched over terminals, their faces pale in the artificial blue light. Nia sat at the center of the network, her eyes darting across a cascading waterfall of green and red code. Everything seemed perfect, too perfect. It was a ghost in the lattice that caught her attention, a subtle rhythmic stutter in the data packets moving toward the offshore escrow accounts. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't a leak or a theft. It was a logic bomb. A kill switch virus had been woven into the very fabric of the merger's smart contracts. If the execution command was sent at dawn, the virus would activate, wiping the syndicate's entire digital footprint and locking billions in a permanent, unreachable encryption loop. It wouldn't just bankrupt Yi Hyun, it would erase him. Nia's fingers blurred across the mechanical keyboard, her mind working with the speed of a high-frequency processor. She began tracing the virus's origin point, bypassing the decoy servers and tunneling through the estate's internal mesh. She followed the digital signature back through the local router, seeking the physical MAC address of the host. The trace stopped at a device that shouldn't have been on the network. It was a high-end, rose gold laptop, currently docked in a room that had supposedly been emptied and locked. "D-sick," Nia whispered into her headset, her voice tight with a mixture of terror and clarity. "The system is compromised. It's not an external hit. Someone left a back door open and the kill switch is live." "Location," the bodyguard's voice crackled back, instantly alert. "Minjai's private quarters," Nia replied, her eyes wide as she watched the virus's countdown timer begin to pulse. She left the laptop behind. It slaved to a remote trigger. She's not just trying to frame me anymore, Yi Hyun. She's burning the whole house down from the outside. Yi Hyun appeared at her shoulder, his face a mask of frozen fury as he stared at the screen. He saw the rose gold icon on the network map, a digital Trojan horse sitting in the heart of his home. "Can you stop it?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I can isolate the laptop, but the virus is already in the main trunk," Nia said, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. "If I cut the connection now, it might trigger the wipe early. I have to stay inside the code and dismantle the triggers one by one while someone physically destroys that laptop." "You have 10 minutes, Yi Hyun said, turning toward the door with a lethal grace. "Hold the line, Nia. Don't let the screen go black." Nia didn't look up. She dived back into the sea of hostile code, her mind the only thing standing between the Lee syndicate and total digital annihilation. The clock was ticking, and the shadows were finally showing their teeth. The digital war room was a symphony of clicking keys and frantic whispers, the air thick with the metallic scent of overheated hardware. Nia's eyes were fixed on the master terminal, her mind weaving through the final defensive layers of the merger's firewall. Yi Hyun stood behind her, a silent, predatory statue, his gaze fixed on the countdown clock. The kill switch had been neutralized, but the air still felt heavy, charged with a static electricity that signaled the storm wasn't over. Nia's focus faltered for a fraction of a second. She glanced at the corner of the screen, the internal security feed for the nursery. The room was empty. The small, ergonomic chair where Hana usually sat to practice her coding was pushed back, the tablet Nia had given her lying face down on the carpet. "Yi Hyun," Nia whispered, her voice cutting through the hum of the servers like a blade. "Where is Hana?" Yi Hyun didn't look away from the main monitor. "D-Sick moved her to the safe room 10 minutes ago. Focus on the escrow release, Nia." "No," Nia said, standing up so abruptly her chair skidded across the marble. "I just checked the biometric logs for the safe room. They haven't been triggered, and D6 is currently on the perimeter checking the secondary gate. The room went deathly silent. Yi Hyun turned, his face draining of color, replaced by a terrifying, cold fury. He didn't need to see the screen. He saw the look in Nia's eyes. She dove back into the system, bypassing the main security hub to access the hidden sensors she had installed in the nursery's floorboards, a project she and Hana had worked on as a game. The sensors picked up a weight signature at 4:12 a.m., Nia reported, her fingers flying. 2 adults, 1 child. They didn't use the halls. They used the service lift in the West Wing. Her breath hitched as she pulled up a grainy, low-light feed from the delivery docks. A black sedan was idling in the shadows, and a woman in a trench coat, Min-jae, was forcing a small, struggling figure into the backseat. Min-jae wasn't just burning the money anymore. She was stealing the heart of the empire. A notification pinged on Yi Hyun's private phone, a video file. He opened it to see Hana, her big eyes wide with terror, sitting in a dark, concrete room. A voice, distorted but carrying Min-jae's sharp cadence, spoke over the image. "The merger assets for the girl's life, Yi Hyun. You have 30 minutes before the tide comes in." "There at the old salt warehouses," Nia said, already pulling up the topographical maps of the coastline. "The signal is bouncing, but the latency on the upload proves they're within a 5-mile radius of the docks." Yi Hyun reached for his weapon, but he looked at Nia, his only true navigator in the dark. The financial experts had failed, the security had been breached, and his girlfriend had turned into a monster. Only the maid saw the truth in time. "Get in the car," he commanded. "You're the only one who can find her." The black sedan was a ghost on the digital map, but Nia knew that every ghost left a footprint. As the SUV roared toward the coast, the engine's vibration rattling her teeth, she didn't look at the dark, blurring scenery of Seoul. Her world was reduced to the glowing grid on her lap. Beside her, Yi Hyun drove with a silent, terrifying lethality, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "They've cut the GPS on the sedan," Yi Hyun rasped, his eyes fixed on the road. "D6 team is losing the trail." "They don't need GPS," Nia countered, her fingers dancing across the screen. "Every smart city sensor in this district is a witness. I'm piggybacking off the automated toll gates and the environmental air quality sensors." She tapped a command, and a series of heat signatures bloomed across the blueprint of the old salt warehouses. "There, Warehouse 4. It's the only one with an active power draw. Min-jae isn't just hiding, she's running a localized jammer to mask her location from your gunmen." Nia pivoted her focus, accessing a hidden layer of the estate's network she had dubbed the Gardener. It was a suite of off-grid surveillance assets D6 had installed years ago, analog backups that didn't rely on the compromised main server. Through a grainy, black-and-white feed from a rusted weather camera, she saw the warehouse entrance. Min-jae was packing near a stack of shipping crates, a burner phone pressed to her ear, while 2 men in heavy coats stood guard. "The gunmen will be too loud," Nia said, her voice dropping to a clinical whisper. "If they see a convoy, they'll use Hana as a shield, but look at the drainage schematics." She overlaid the warehouse blueprints with the city's old plumbing maps. "There's a maintenance crawlspace that leads directly into the subfloor of the office where they're holding her. It's too small for your soldiers, but I can get through." Yi Hyun glanced at her, his expression a mix of agony and awe. "It's a trap, Nia, if you're caught." "I won't be," she interrupted, her eyes obsidian bright with a genius-level certainty. "I've calculated the patrol loops. D6 can create a silent distraction at the north perimeter using the Gardener sensors to trip their jammers. While they're focused on the ghost signals, I'll be under their feet." As the SUV screeched to a halt in the shadows of a crumbling pier, Nia shed her blazer, revealing the athletic build she usually hid beneath oversized sweaters. She grabbed a small tablet and a handheld frequency disruptor. She wasn't the maid anymore, and she wasn't just a strategist. She was the only variable Min-jae hadn't accounted for, the one person who knew exactly how to dismantle a nightmare from the inside out. Without a word, She disappeared into the fog, moving toward the rusted heart of the warehouse. The warehouse air was thick with the scent of salt and rot, a stark contrast to the sterile, digital battlefield Nia had occupied all night. She huddled behind a rusted steel pillar, her tablet glowing like a beacon in the gloom. 20 feet away, inside the glass-walled shipping office, Minjai stood over Hana, her face twisted in a desperate, ugly triumph. "Sign the transfer, Yi Hyun." Minjai's voice echoed through the rafters, shrill and frantic. "The merger is over. Your legacy is mine." Yi Hyun stepped into the center of the warehouse floor, his hands raised, but his eyes were fixed on the shadow where Nia was hidden. He was the distraction, the bait in a game of high-stakes human chess. "The money is moving, Minjai," he said, his voice a low, terrifying calm. "But you've forgotten who actually holds the ledger." Nia's fingers blurred across the screen. She wasn't just stopping the transfer. She was executing a masterpiece of digital retribution. She tapped into the rival's offshore clearinghouse, the very accounts Minjai had planned to use as her escape fund. Using the kill switch, virus Minjai had intended for Yi Hyun, Nia inverted the logic, turning the predatory code back on its creators. 60 seconds, Nia whispered to herself, the countdown beginning. The warehouse doors burst open as Minjai's hired mercenaries realized the digital tide had turned. Gunfire shattered the silence, the rhythmic crack-crack of suppressed weapons splintering the wooden crates around Nia. Yi Hyun moved with a lethal, fluid grace, a king protecting his most valuable asset. He intercepted the first attacker with a bone-shattering strike, using the man as a shield as he surged toward Nia's position. "Stay on the keys," Yi Hyun roared over the chaos. He stood over her, a wall of tailored black silk and iron will firing back at the shadows. Every time a mercenary tried to flank her, Yi Hyun was there, his movements clinical and absolute. Nia didn't flinch. She watched the progress bar, 80%, 90%. In the office, Minjai's laptop began to beep frantically, a notification that her own accounts were being bled dry, redirected into a trust fund in Hana's name that no Mafia hand could ever touch. "Done," Nia gasped as the screen turned a triumphant green. The power in the warehouse surged and died, the jammers failing as Nia's script locked every door and disabled every weaponized signal. In the sudden, heavy silence, the only sound was the sobbing of a ruined woman and the steady, heavy breathing of the man who had traded his throne for the safety of a maid and a child. The payback was complete. The rivals were bankrupt, and the Lee Syndicate had a new architect. The violent echoes of the warehouse had been replaced by a heavy, crystalline silence. The dawn broke over Seoul in shades of pale violet and gold, the light catching the glass towers of the city and making them look like a new world being born. On the grand balcony of the Lee estate, the air was crisp, washed clean by the passing storm. Nia stood by the railing, her hands no longer shaking. She was no longer wearing the midnight silk of a guest or the apron of a maid. She wore a sharp, tailored suit that felt like the skin she was always meant to inhabit. Beside her, Hana sat on a garden bench, happily engrossed in a new tablet, her face bright with the peace of a child who finally felt safe. Yi Hyun stepped out from the study, his presence no longer a shadow, but a pillar of the new structure they had built. He didn't look at the city, he looked at Nia. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored vellum. "The police have processed Minjai and the advisors," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum. "The old accounts are closed. The new merger is being heralded as the largest clean energy transition in the country's history. The dark world is behind us." He held out the paper. Nia took it, her eyes scanning the elegant script. It wasn't a renewal of her domestic services, nor was it a bonus for her genius. It was a partnership agreement for the Lee Carter Strategic Group. At the bottom, his signature was already dry, waiting for hers. "I promised you a way to finish your degree, Nia," Yi Hyun said, stepping closer. But I realized that the universities have nothing left to teach you. I don't want an employee. I don't want someone who works for me. I want the person who saved my daughter and my soul to stand beside me as an equal." Nia looked from the contract to the man who had seen the brilliance hidden behind the scrub brush. She saw the respect in his eyes, a currency far more valuable than the billions she had saved. She took the pen from his hand and signed her name with a flourish that felt like a declaration of war against her own past. "The maid is officially retired," Nia said, a witty, confident spark returning to her eyes. "And the strategist is just beginning," Yi Hyun replied. He didn't offer a ring of submission, but he did take her hand, their fingers intertwining as they looked out over the empire they had purged of its toxins. The era of fear was over. The era of the mind had begun. Together, they watched the sun rise fully over a city that would never again see them as anything less than a dynasty.